Hey guys, welcome back. We are officially halfway through our ancient Egypt notes. We're going to move on to politics now. So today's going to be our day for politics. We're going to look at ancient Egypt as it was divided, or has been divided, I should say, by historians into three sections. So let's get into politics here of ancient Egypt. So the government was closely tied to their religion. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it. The Pharaoh, who was the head of the government, was thought to be a god. So their religion was very closely tied to the government, and the government very closely tied to their religion. Obviously, the Pharaoh held the highest position in the government because he was thought to be a descendant of the gods. And we know that already. You should know that hopefully from 2 videos ago when we looked at religion. So the Pharaoh still holds that highest position. He's the highest position in the social class. He owns everything according to the belief. The Pharaoh literally owned everything in Egypt. And so because he held that highest position, he was very closely tied to their religion, believed he was a descendant of the gods, all that kind of fun stuff that goes with that. Now, the Pharaoh had many important jobs when leading his citizens, or her citizens. They did that in leading in the construction of temples. That was a big thing. So the pyramids would have been built because the pharaohs told them to. So they led the citizens in construction of temples. They created laws and taxes. So taxes was something that was new in Egypt as well. We see that a lot of times these ancient civilizations, you see that taxes comes up in all of them. Taxes here in ancient Egypt was done through the giving of grain or some sort of crop as a tax rather than money. The pharaohs also organized labor and trade. They were in charge of making sure that people were getting their work done, that things were being built in an orderly fashion, that trade was being taken care of, and of course was in charge of defense. So when people did eventually come and try to conquer Egypt, the pharaoh was in charge of making sure that the armies were sent out to where they needed to be and put the right people in charge, things along those lines. All pretty typical stuff for a leader. Now, when it came to power being passed on, power was passed down to a son or a nephew after the pharaoh's passing. Most times it was passed down to a male descendant. Now, not always. There were some times where power was passed down to a daughter, or the wife took charge after the pharaoh passed and became pharaoh herself. That was the case with Hatshepsut, which was one of the most famous but not very well known Egyptian pharaohs. She, or I should say not the most famous, but she was one of the most influential Egyptian pharaohs. I wish we had time to talk more about Hatshepsut. Not a lot is known about her, but because we think more of like Cleopatra and King Tut, but she was an incredible character in ancient Egypt. But back to what I was saying. Power most of the time was passed down to a male descendant. A son, a nephew, something along those lines. But power tended to stay in the family if it could. Now there were times that power obviously passed outside the family, whether the family was conquered or whatever else. But most of the time it stayed in the family, just as it normally is with ancient civilizations. Now early Egypt had 2 kingdoms. One in Lower Egypt and one in Upper Egypt. So when Egypt was first established, when the civilization was first growing, it kind of was split into 2 different sections. There was Lower Egypt, which was at the top of the map. I know that seems weird, but it was at the very top near the delta of the Nile River by the Mediterranean Sea, was Lower Egypt, and then Upper Egypt was farther down south along the Nile River, more towards where the Nile River starts, which is why it was considered Upper Egypt, because the Nile River started that direction. So it had 2 kingdoms. Now, eventually these kingdoms were united in 3000 BCE by King Narmer becoming the first pharaoh. So these 2 kingdoms were kind of separate from each other, just kind of existed in 2 different parts, and eventually those kingdoms were brought together by King Narmer. He came in, became the first pharaoh, and united all of Egypt together under one rule. Egypt spans a very large space, not as big as China, but still spanned a large area. So this was a big undertaking to unite these 2 kingdoms together. but he eventually did and became the first actual pharaoh. Now, when we look at Egyptian history, we divide it up into three periods based on the kingdoms and dynasties that were in power. So we see dynasties come up again here in ancient Egypt, just like they did in China. But when we look at Egyptian history, we divide it into kind of three sections based on what was happening. And they're not very creatively named, but it's kind of what it is. So we start with the Old Kingdom. We start with the Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom first established in 2686 BCE and lasted until 2125 BCE. So the Old Kingdom came first. And this was a great time of prosperity, achievement, and power. A lot of big things happened in the Old Kingdom. The pyramids were built, or started to be built in the Old Kingdom. The Sphinx was also built in the time of the Old Kingdom. The different kingdoms had been united into one Egypt, and so there was a lot of flourishing that happened. Irrigation was not quite a thing yet. It becomes more of a thing here in our next kingdom that we're going to look at. But we see a lot of prosperity and achievement and power. Hieroglyphics first starts to come in this time period. This is where one of the more famous pharaohs that came out of this time would be the pharaoh King Khufu, who was the one who had the 3 great pyramids in Giza built for him, his son, and his grandson. So that is something that happened here in the Old Kingdom. A lot of the establishment of Egypt that we know of today began in this Old Kingdom. Now, moving past the Old Kingdom, we move into the Middle Kingdom from 2055 to 1650. So there was so if you look at it here, we go from 2125 here, and then we have 2055. So there's like 100-ish years in there where there isn't a kingdom established. That's because there was a period of civil wars that happened. As was the same thing when we looked at China, when we looked at the different dynasties, civil war tends to break out when there's no agreement on who should be in charge. So these civil wars kind of came into play and kept a kingdom from being established, but we see one eventually be established here, which then becomes the Middle Kingdom. This is where we see a lot of irrigation being built. The pharaohs dealt with the Nile's flooding by building a system of canals to drain the water and irrigate farmland. So we're growing, but we're having issues with the Nile, the Middle Kingdom. This is where we start to see them realize that we can do something with this water. We can create irrigation. So the pharaohs deal with this by instructing people to build canals and kind of irrigate the system. Eventually, we'll talk about, I don't think it's here. Yeah. Eventually, we will talk about, I think it's an achievement, or in economics, the next video. We'll look at one of the most famous canals that was built during this Middle Kingdom time that still actually exists today. It's changed, but the basics of it still stand today. So the Middle Kingdom was also a very influential time with a lot of prosperity. So after Middle Kingdom, we see another period of civil wars happen again, and we come up with the New Kingdom that lasted from 1550 to 1070 BCE. Again, civil wars is keeping us from jumping right into a new kingdom. It's kind of what ends one kingdom and starts the next. So the New Kingdom comes in at 1550, and this is where a lot of the really well-known pharaohs were in power. So King Tut, for a very, very short amount of time that he lived, he lived in this New Kingdom time period. So did Hatshepsut. Cleopatra was during this time. Right towards the end of kind of this New Kingdom actually is when Cleopatra came into power. But the pharaohs in this particular kingdom were more about conquering. So we see that the pharaohs conquered a lot of land in Africa and Asia. So they kind of expanded out. They kept kind of going south and then going up into the east to conquer more land. So the pharaohs kind of, in this time, are more characterized as being ones who tended to conquer land. So they can't conquer land in Africa and Asia, which again led to a big boom, more prosperity. Eventually we see the decline of Egypt when we're faced with invasions. The Persians eventually come in, and take over the area. We know when we studied Mesopotamia that the Babylonians had conquered Egypt at one point too. The Egyptians take power back, but they eventually are taken over by the Persians, and they can't break away. Not until they eventually become established as their own area, again, do we see them break away from the Persians. So this decline happened because of these invasions, which tends to be the case. If you know anything about Cleopatra, you know that she let some of the Greeks into a lot of things that happened there. So some really interesting history that I wish we could go more into, but that's where we're going to stop for today. So if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me and Miss Hurlis. We're going to take a brief little segue here, and you're going to do an article on either achievement or politics, and then we'll pick up with economics right after that. So I'll let you guys get started. Good luck.